one of the great humanitarian crises facing the planet, and also in an historical way to make certain that the United States Congress reasserts its constitutional responsibilities in terms of warmaking. In March of 2015, as you know, under the leadership of Mohammed bin Salman, who was Saudi's defense minister at the time and is now the crown prince, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates intervened in Yemen's ongoing civil war. The result of the Saudi-led intervention has been the creation of the worst humanitarian crisis in modern history. According to the United Nations, the war in Yemen could lead to the most severe famine in more than 100 years, with some 100 million people at risk of starvation in one of the poorest countries on earth as a result of this war. According to the aid organization Save the Children, some 85,000 children in Yemen have already died of starvation, and millions more face death if this horrible war continues. Further, Yemen is currently experiencing the worst cholera outbreak in the world, with as many as 10,000 new cases each week, according to the World Health Organization. This is a disease spread by infected water that causes severe diarrhea and dehydration and will only accelerate the death rate. The cholera outbreak has occurred because Saudi bombs have destroyed Yemen's water infrastructure and people no longer have access to clean water. Late last year, I had the opportunity to meet with several very brave human rights activists from Yemen, urging Congress to put a stop to this war. And they told me very clearly, when Yemenis see "Made in USA" on the bombs that are killing them, it tells them that the United States of America is responsible for this war. This is not a message the United States should be sending to the world. The United States should not be supporting a catastrophic war led by a despotic Saudi regime with a dangerous and irresponsible military policy. On December 13th, 2018, just over a month ago, a majority of the United States Senate agreed with that proposition and voted to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. My colleagues, Mike Lee, Republican of Utah, Chris Murphy, a Democrat of Connecticut, and I brought together Republicans and Democrats in a very historic moment. For the first time, 45 years after the passage of the War Powers Act, the United States Senate came together to reassert its constitutional responsibility and make clear that the power of war-making rests with the United States Congress, not with a president, whether that president is a Republican or a Democrat, and that our unauthorized engagement in the war in Yemen must end. What the United States Senate said in no uncertain terms is that we will not continue to have our military posture dictated by a despotic, murderous regime in Saudi Arabia, a regime which does not respect democracy, which does not respect human rights, a regime whose leader was involved in the horrific murder of dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Turkey. I should add that in the midst of this horrific tragedy in Yemen, there is some good news. In December, the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, Martin Griffiths, was able to achieve a ceasefire agreement enabling humanitarian aid to be delivered. We know that action, the action by the United States Congress in calling for an end to our involvement in that war, played a key role in pushing the Saudi coalition into that ceasefire agreement. Currently, that ceasefire is in danger of breaking down So it is essential that the House and the Senate act and act very soon. Today, we come together to reintroduce the same resolution that has already passed the Senate, and I am confident will pass the House. Last session, as you will recall, a similar resolution with widespread support was introduced in the House, but was prevented from getting a vote by the then Republican leadership. That political situation in the House has obviously changed, and I'm confident that this resolution will come up for a vote there and will win. Our immediate job must be to end the terrible war in Yemen and provide humanitarian relief there rather than bombs. Further, the time is long overdue for the Congress to reclaim its constitutional right in terms of war-making and to make certain that no president, Republican or Democrat, engages in a military conflict unauthorized by the United States Congress. Let me start off with Senator Mike Lee. Mike.
Thank you very much, Senator Sanders. I want to thank you and Senator Murphy and our dear friends from the House for helping us with this effort. Look, war is a tragic thing. War brings about death and immense human suffering. War has consequences that last not just years, but decades and generations and centuries. It's one of the reasons why one of the most tragic, difficult, and morally consequential decisions any nation can make ever involves going to war. It is precisely for this reason that in our system of government, that decision is vested not in one person, but in the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. A branch of government consisting of two chambers, one with 100 people, one with 435. The 435 are elected every single 2 years. And the branch with the chamber with 100 people can be fired every 6 years. And the American people have some consequence attached to this. Even when we get involved in a war a little bit often turns into the camel's nose into the tent. And before we know it, we can be much more involved. But regardless, getting involved in a war is nonetheless a war. The fact that we don't necessarily have a massive force of American boots on the ground in this day and age doesn't mean we're not fighting in a war. Imagine, for example, the fact that we have been providing mid-air refueling for combat flights for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia-led coalition. These are combat flights going into and out of the theater of war in Yemen, a war that's half a world away, a war in which very few Americans could identify an American interest, that is, an interest that actually affects their day-to-day safety. The fact that they can't is due in part to the fact that this is a decision that was made within one branch of government by one person. First a Democratic president, President Obama, and later under our current president, a Republican. And that decision has never been debated and discussed and voted on and approved by Congress. This is one of the distinguishing characteristics between our current government and our former government based in London. As Hamilton explained in Federalist 69, the King of England had the ability to take the country to war without going to Parliament first. The American president does not have that power. And it doesn't matter, as Senator Sanders said, whether that's a Republican president or a Democratic president or a president in the future who may have some other party affiliation or none at all. What matters is that the Congress must approve the war. Now, if we were talking about someone, let's say, robbing a bank, if you had someone who drove the bank robber to the bank, identified which bank would be robbed, provided logistical assistance in identifying exactly where the cash was, which tellers would be on shift at the moment, how best they could get to the cash, and then drove the bank robber away, we would say that person is involved in a bank robbery. We would say that that person not only aided and abetted in, but committed a conspiracy to engage in a bank robbery. Now, obviously, this is not a perfect analogy, and I don't mean to suggest criminal activity here, because it's different than that. But what I do mean to suggest is the mere fact that we are providing mid-air refueling for combat missions going in and out of Yemen, the fact that we're doing target selection assistance, we're providing reconnaissance, surveillance, intelligence information, and otherwise providing combat support for this war effort, does in fact mean we were involved in a war. And that does in fact mean that we need to declare that war, that needs to be authorized by Congress. It can't be done by the executive branch alone. The American people deserve more and should demand better than this. Now, we were very heartened when a few weeks ago the United States Senate voted for the first time in the 45-year history of the War Powers Act to call for us to get out. We sent a loud message to the executive branch. We've got two options. This is a binary choice. Let's either get out of this war in Yemen, or alternatively, have the president propose an authorization for the use of military force or declaration of war. Either way, this needs to come to one of those decision points. It's only when it's debated and discussed here that the American people can be brought into the process and we can have the moral authority to do what needs to be done there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Representative Khanna.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. As Senator Sanders mentioned, this will be the first time in the history of this country since 1973 that we will successfully pass a war powers resolution through the Senate and through the House. I want to make one thing clear. This would not have happened if it were not for Senator Sanders' leadership. I'm going to recognize some of the others too. But when we in the House started this effort, they said, go talk to Matt Duss in Senator Sanders' office. Go talk to Senator Sanders. I said, he just got 13 million votes. He's not going to take this up. And we had a 5-minute meeting, and Senator Sanders said, I'm going to go and introduce this in the Senate. And that really gave this issue huge credibility, along with Senator Chris Murphy, who has been speaking out about the violence in Yemen for many, many years. So I want to recognize both of them. I also want to recognize Walter Jones, who was one of the first Republicans to co-sponsor this with Mark Pocan and me. Representative Jones is fighting for his life. Our thoughts and prayers are with him. But even in that position, he is committed to this resolution because he understands how important it is to end this war. And it's great to see Congressman Buck and Senator Lee here and Congresswoman Jayapal, who has pushed so hard to make sure we get a vote. I want to just make 3 basic points. Now, Amartya Sen said that famine is always a political problem. It's not because we don't have enough food or enough medicine. He did this study on the 1943 famine in West Bengal. 3 million people were dead, and it was because of human incompetence. 14 million people face the possibility of famine in Yemen. And it's not some complex reason why they face famine. They face famine because there's been a bombing of the ports, and the coalition isn't allowing the food and medicine to get in. They're blocking it with inspections. And what we're saying is let the food and medicine get in so we don't see pictures of kids starving. There's no complex foreign policy. It's a matter of human decency. And this resolution will make it clear that the coalition should stop the bombing campaign and come to the table and negotiate. The second point, people say, well, what difference is it going to make? What difference is it going to make on the ground? We know when Senator Sanders and Senator Lee passed the resolution in the House, this is reported fact. Secretary Mattis at the time called the coalition and said, stop embarrassing us. The Senate has just moved, come to the table and negotiate. I am 100% convinced that the only reason those parties have come to the negotiating table with Special Envoy Griffith is because the Congress is acting. You know, when I was young, we used to visit extended family in India. And one of the things my uncle said is when the United States sneezes, the world listens. Sometimes we underestimate how much influence we have. When we pass this resolution through the House and the Senate, I guarantee you that the coalition and the Houthis will come to the table to have a longer ceasefire. The final point, as Senator Sanders said, this is a clear reassertion of our role of Congress, so that in the future, when there is a president who thinks about getting involved in another intervention, they will know that the Congress isn't impotent. They will know that this Congress, on a bipartisan basis, is willing to invoke the war powers to prevent us from getting into more foreign interventions that aren't in our interest. Thank you.
Ron. Senator Murphy?
Thank you very much, Bernie. Thank you all for joining us here today. In 2006, Senator Rand Paul and I brought a resolution before the United States Senate to object to an arms sale to Saudi Arabia that was going to be used in a war inside Yemen that, frankly, very few people in the United States Congress knew anything about, never mind the American public. That resolution of disapproval got just over 20 votes in the United States Senate. And so I am so thankful for Senator Sanders and Senator Lee's leadership, such that just a month ago we were able to convince the majority of our colleagues, finally, after years and years of pressing this case, that this is no longer in the security interests of the United States, nor is it allowable by the Constitution for our country to be involved in this war inside Yemen. From a moral standpoint and from a national security standpoint, the war inside Yemen is a disaster for the United States. Bernie laid out the humanitarian nightmare that exists inside that country today. Let me say the number again: 85,000 children under the age of 5 have died of starvation and disease because of a man-made humanitarian catastrophe that has been in part supported by the United States. But second, this is a national security nightmare for the United States. Yes, every single one of those bombs is stamped with made in the USA. And Yemenis know this. They don't see this as a Saudi bombing campaign. They see this as an American bombing campaign. And it is no coincidence that over the course of the last 3 years of this war, Al-Qaeda and ISIS have both grown and grown in strength inside Yemen, as the chaos of the civil war creates space for them to expand, and young Yemenis get radicalized against the United States, the very country that is bombing them. And so we hear over and over again that the number one priority of our national security policy should be protecting the United States from attack again from radical extremist groups who may seek to do harm to us. Well, if that is your number one priority, then the United States needs to get the hell out of Yemen, where we are increasing the likelihood, not decreasing the likelihood, that we will once again be attacked by the most lethal harm of Al-Qaeda, which is stronger than it was 3 years ago inside Yemen. The administration concedes to the humanitarian catastrophe. The administration concedes to the fact that the extremist groups inside Yemen have gotten stronger. The reason they present to us that we should continue our support for this bombing campaign is that the Saudis are an ally. What kind of ally kidnaps a resident of your country who is seeking our protection, brings him into a consulate, chops him up, and makes him disappear? The nature of this alliance has been exposed over the course of the last 30 days. The Saudis lied to us for 2 weeks about what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, just as they were lying to us for years about their true intentions in Yemen. They told us that it was a mistake over and over again, that they were hitting civilian targets, that they were hitting churches and weddings and schools and water treatment facilities, when in fact, many of those were not mistakes. They were deliberate attempts to try to rain terror on the Yemeni people to force the Houthis to the bargaining table. Lastly, to underscore the point that has already been made over and over again, we do believe that this war is illegal, that it is not allowed by a constitution which vests in the Congress the power to declare war. And admittedly, war declarations are very difficult these days because we don't have armies marching against each other across wide open battlefields. We very rarely have neat peace treaties that wrap up hostilities. But just because declaring war is hard doesn't mean that the Constitution doesn't still require us to do it. If Congress cannot muster the political will to declare war in a far-off place, then the president cannot perpetuate that war. These days, that is worth reminding to our colleagues over and over and over again.
Thanks, Chris. Representative Buck.
Thank you, Senator Sanders, and my other colleagues for being here. My heart, as do my friends, go out to the people of Yemen and the catastrophe that we see going on there. I am not here because of that. I am here because we have a constitutional issue, and we need to address that constitutional issue. There are many catastrophes, humanitarian crises going on around the world. I believe very strongly that we don't know all that we need to know to be able to make a decision on whether we should go forward in Yemen or not. But it is the decision that needs to be made in Congress as to whether we go forward or not. It's the decision that we need to uphold the Constitution. There's one thing that I believe the United States House and Senate are very good at, and that's avoiding hard decisions. And we need to stop avoiding a hard decision in this situation. We need to make that decision, and we need to force the administration and the leadership in both houses to the table, give us the information that we need so that we can make a wise decision. This is not the only issue that we have with the War Powers Act in this country. There are many others, and we need to be involved and address those others. But this is a great starting place because of the humanitarian crisis, because of our involvement, because of our allies. We need to make sure that we have the information we need to make the decision. I am proud to support this, and I think when you look at the politics of the people that are up here, you understand that there are folks on the right and on the left. These are not squishy people in the middle. These are people that I stand proudly with because we are all willing to make tough decisions and to move forward in tough ways. We may not agree on the final vote, frankly, but we need to have that vote and we need to have that information. So thank you very much for making this opportunity available to us.
Congresswoman Jayapal.
Thank you so much, Senator Sanders, and thank you for your tremendous, bold leadership on this issue, and I'd like to thank our other senators as well. I think this is an incredibly important moment for us as a bipartisan House and Senate to make our views clear. I want to especially call out my colleague, Khanna, who in just 2 years has really become an expert on so many important foreign policy issues and has pushed doggedly to make sure that we do get this vote in the House, which will happen. Today's display is, I think, a powerful reminder of what a committed group of bipartisan lawmakers can achieve. For 2 years, members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which I have the honor of co-chairing with Representative Mark Pocan, have worked very closely with constitutional conservatives in both chambers of Congress to remedy a disorder that is also bipartisan in nature: unconstitutional war-making. We all have a shared understanding. Not only does unfettered, unauthorized conflict harm countless people abroad, it corrodes our democracy at home, and I think that is a very important point. In February of 1962, a reporter raised a criticism to President John F. Kennedy that he had, quote, been less than candid with the American people as to how deeply we are involved in Vietnam, end quote. Kennedy replied, "We have increased our assistance to the government, its logistics, but we have not sent combat troops in the generally understood sense of the word." These are his words. He said, "We are attempting to prevent a communist takeover of Vietnam." In reality, the U.S. government had already deployed military personnel to Vietnam, which ballooned to more than 11,000 so-called military advisors by the end of that same year. Both Democratic and Republican administrations concealed the true scope of U.S. involvement in the war, concerned that the American people would not support the active role that these forces had already begun to play in combat. Over a decade later, the War Powers Act of 1973 was enacted over Nixon's veto in reaction to a war that had engulfed Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, all countries that I've spent quite a considerable time in, killing millions of civilians. The legislative intent of that bill was made clear at the time: to prevent secret, unauthorized military support activities and to prevent a repetition of many of the most regrettable and controversial actions in Indochina. And yet, for decades, U.S. military intervention has been deliberated on, decided, and executed in the corridors of the White House and the Pentagon in secret, behind closed doors, and without the consent of the governed. The American people have the constitutional right to a transparent debate and a vote by their members of Congress before a war is attempted and to end an unauthorized war already underway. But the legislature must act. And that is why, in the face of the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe, now nearly 4 years old, we are reasserting the War Powers Act to end the U.S. Saudi military campaign. The Saudi regime has used blockades and bombings with U.S. participation to push 14 million people to the brink of starvation. Just as in Vietnam, U.S. forces secretly and illegally accompany, coordinate, advise, and provide logistical support to Saudi forces fighting in Yemen. So make no mistake, the United States is at war. Congress is poised to pass this bill in both chambers, marking the first time in U.S. history that the legislature will direct the president to end unconstitutional war. We have a moral obligation to enact this bill to end the violence, to allow food and medicine back into Yemen, and to ensure that millions of the most vulnerable people on earth not perish, but live. Thank you.
Questions? Yes, sir. Can you identify where you're from, who you are?
NBC News. Frank Thorpe, NBC News.
Frank.
The president tweeted this morning that, quote, the intelligence people seem to be extremely passive and naive when it comes to the dangers of Iran. They are wrong. Stepping away from the idea of Iran, but I mean, it's related in some ways. Why do you think the president is so skeptical of the intelligence agencies that work for him? And do you wish that they would listen to him, or he would listen to them more?
You're asking us to comment on a president's tweet.
On intelligence, though, I mean, this is
All right,
related
look,
to
we have a
foreign
president,
policy.
I don't want to go into my views on President Trump, who says one thing today and may say something very opposite tomorrow. Obviously, I think that a president of the United States might want to be listening to people who have made their entire lives the understanding of intelligence gathering and what's going on in the world. And that we have a president that disregards that is one of many, many problems that we have in the White House. Yeah.
Senator Sanders, Fadi Mansour with Al Jazeera. Are you confident you have enough votes in the Senate to pass this resolution again? And do you have enough votes in both chambers to have a veto?
Well, let's start off. Do we have enough votes, Mike? I think we do. I think there's no reason to think that we don't have at least as many votes. And I think the sentiment is with us. In the House, I'm pretty sure you do. Is that the case? There you go. And then I think what happens, President Trump is going to have to make a decision. And that is the House will be speaking on this issue. The Senate will be speaking on this issue. And I think the overwhelming majority of the American people, for all the reasons you heard, the humanitarian desire, the need for the United States Congress to respect the Constitution and take responsibility for war-making, I think for all of those reasons, widespread support among the American people. What the president will do, your guess is as good as mine.
Bernie, can I just quickly add, and Rivers and Khanna mentioned this. It is only congressional action that has forced this administration to change policy and the two parties to the negotiating table. And so, listen, we are hopeful that this becomes law. We understand that would require overriding a veto from the president, but the action in the past has been the forcing mechanism which has got us closer to peace and has pulled the United States further out of this conflict. And I would expect that the same thing will happen as we begin this debate in the House and the Senate.
With or without the president's signature. Yeah, sir.
This is a question from
You are, sir, from where?
Tim Mack with NPR.
Yeah.
This is a question for Senator Lee and Congressman Buck. Could you speak to the support within among your Republican colleagues on this matter, and whether you see it in a broader context of Republicans asserting congressional independence against, in contrast to the president's foreign policy instincts?
I think it's both. I'm always reluctant to speak for any member of the Senate other than myself, but based on my conversations with my Republican colleagues, those who have voted for it have first increased in number quite a bit since we voted earlier in 2018, between the time we voted in the spring of 2018 and the time we voted in December. It failed previously. It succeeded in December. And that reflected the fact that more people got on board. Some of them told me they were brought on board because of the separation of powers issue. Others were perhaps prompted a little bit by that and prompted a little bit more by the fact that when they saw what happened with Mr. Khashoggi, that caused them to lose a little bit of confidence in the fact that we are assisting the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in its coalition-led effort against the Houthis. And if I can respond to the tweet, to what you said about the tweet a minute ago, I hadn't seen the tweet. I'm not sure I want to make sure I understand it correctly. One thing I will say is, if we do have a president who appears to have enough curiosity, enough interest to be willing to second guess on some occasions those who may be surrounding him. The fact that he was willing to signal his intent, his desire to get us out of Syria, to get us out of Afghanistan, is something that I know went against what many were telling him inside of his administration. And I think that is something from which we can take encouragement in this effort. The fact that he's willing to view things from a different angle is a good thing. And I hope and expect that in this circumstance, he might reach that point with respect to the conflict in Yemen.
When it comes to the intelligence agencies, though, when they unanimously seem to come to a conclusion based on evidence, what is it that President Trump, do you think, knows that the intelligence agencies...
Yeah, look, I really have no idea. And so I can't speak for him on that. I don't have access to everything that he's got. All I'm saying is the fact that he is willing in some circumstances to say, I'm being told X, and I nonetheless think I should do Y, could itself signal some reason to have confidence here. I know there are a lot of people within the administration telling him to continue to sustain the war effort in Yemen. And we think he shouldn't. I hope, I expect he may well get to the point that we have reached.
Congressman Buck, do you want to briefly respond?
Just briefly, I'm not sure that we have a majority of Republicans in the House that would support this, but I think if we don't, we have a substantial minority in the House that would support this based on constitutional grounds alone. And I think combining that with the support from the other side of the aisle, we will have support in the House to be able to pass this.
In the House or in the Senate?
I'm speaking about the House.
My question was, again, about the Senate.
I was answering this gentleman's question.
Do you see this as part of a broader theme of Republicans willing to assert their independence in contrast to the president's foreign policy?
I think the president's foreign policy is popular within the House Republicans, and I think that we will work hand in hand with the president to seek answers in this way. I think this is a move that will help us establish a relationship with the president and actually enhance the working relationship on foreign policy.
Okay. One last question, ma'am.
To follow up to Tim's question, take this alongside, mostly for the senators. Senator McConnell has an amendment to about Afghanistan and Syria, which is also a little bit of a rebuke to the president. So if you take, I'm assuming you guys are not going to support it, but I would love to hear that. But taking that with your war powers resolution, can you talk to the broader idea of the president's foreign policy, and is he on the wrong side of Congress on so many
Well, that's a big discussion. I think all that I can say today, and repeat what my colleagues have said, is we are in an historical moment where major foreign policy issues must, for the first time in many years, be debated in the House and the Senate, and that we cannot continue to abdicate that responsibility to the White House. Okay, with that, thank you all very much.